So welcome back. My name's Jim Sabanius. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School. I direct the Harvard Negotiation Project, which is part of the program on negotiation, and happily and easily collaborating with Nick's Future of Diplomacy program. I'll be the lead moderator on the discussion of the Gulf War Coalition and the Madrid Peace Conference process. We got into those topics in a very nice way this morning, or in the first session, and we'll build on that as we go forward. Soon we'll ask you for your questions, and one thing I would ask is speak slowly, simply, clearly, with the microphone close to your mouth. We get a lot of echo up here, and it'll make it much easier to answer the good questions that you're posing. I want to introduce as well, those of you who weren't here in the first session, Professor Nick Burns, career diplomat, now professor at the Kennedy School, who heads the program on the future of diplomacy and co-chair of the event. And my colleague and friend, Professor Bob Mnookin, professor at Harvard Law School, and who is the chair of the program on negotiation. And the three of us will be dealing with these two questions. I simply don't need to introduce Secretary James Baker. He got a lovely introduction before. So as we launch into these cases, which I think you've noticed are very closely linked. German reunification, the final act was signed in Moscow in September, immediately following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd. When President Bush declared the war aims accomplished in February, it was scarcely a week before Secretary Baker and his team were back in the Middle East on the road that would lead to the Madrid Peace Conference, really the first meeting of Arabs and Israelis face-to-face in a multilateral conference. So these are linked in time, and they're linked by personalities, and they're linked in policy. They're not separate. Before we get into some of the negotiation and diplomatic insights, I'd love to turn to Secretary Baker and ask if you could give us your sort of big picture view of the Gulf War and kind of how we should understand it at 50,000-foot view, and then we'll delve into some specifics.
Okay, I'll be glad to, Jim. Let me first add to something I said this morning. I told us, earlier this afternoon, I told a story about how I was in Siberia negotiating arms control with the Soviet foreign minister when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and how I'd gotten a message from the State Department saying things look bad, you might want to check with your interlocutor there. We're worried about whether Iraq's going to invade Kuwait, and he said no, Saddam would not be that foolish. I said, you better go back and check with the KGB. CIA says we got a lot of troops massing on the border of Kuwait. He went back, checked, he said he would not be that foolish. Those troops may be there, but they're only looking perhaps at a little disputed strip up there of oil territory. And then I said that we ended up meeting, standing shoulder to shoulder in an airport in Moscow the next day, condemning that move by Iraq, the Soviet client state. I've always said that to me was a clear marker for the end of the Cold War. What I neglected to say was the reason Shevardnadze agreed to do that and stand there with the American Secretary of State and condemn their own client state without ever clearing it with Gorbachev is because he was so embarrassed about the fact that the KGB had advised him wrongly, and he had twice given me bum advice, and he was embarrassed about that. And that's why we got him to stand up and condemn Iraq and agree to an arms embargo. Okay, big picture on the Gulf War. This was a clear case of unprovoked aggression by a big state against a small state. It was also something that had the potential of adversely affecting American national interest. I've been in 3 administrations, and in every one of those we had as a policy, written down as a policy, that we would go to war to protect the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf because our economy depended upon it. Here we were, the fourth largest army in the world marches on its smaller neighbor. It's positioned there on the Arabian Peninsula, and it's not something that we could permit to stand. And in fact, President Bush, one of his first statements was, "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait." Nobody parsed that statement at the time to figure out exactly what it meant. Did it mean political and diplomatic and economic sanction? Did it mean war, military, and so forth? But he was clear about it. We were not going to let that continue. And as a matter of fact, Saddam was in a position, had he wanted to do so, to march all the way down the Arabian Peninsula. He could have gone right through Saudi Arabia, and we're fortunate that he didn't. President Bush responded fairly rapidly. We sent troops after getting permission from King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. We sent troops to the region. This was the first post-Cold War threat to global peace, and it was something that we felt we had to respond to. We had a lot of toing and froing, and we'll talk about this later perhaps, about how we should do that, and whether we should go to the United Nations to get a resolution of the UN Security Council. A lot of people didn't think we should do that. The Secretary of Defense didn't think we should do it. The Prime Minister of the UK didn't think we should do it. And we debated that quite a bit, up one side and down the other. We ended up going to the Security Council. We waited, of course, until the United States was in the chair. We did it at the level of foreign ministers. I was the foreign minister of the United States and in the chair. And so I was in control of whether we would ever bring the issue up for a vote. And we would never have brought the issue up for a vote unless we knew we had the votes to succeed. I said in the earlier session, one of the things that I think helped me as Secretary of State was that I had run 5 presidential campaigns. And I knew the value of political credibility and political currency. And we all recognize that if we went for a resolution and didn't get it, we'd be worse off than if we hadn't gone for it. So we were never going to go for that resolution unless we knew we had the votes. Second thing we were never going to do was negotiate down from the resolution we did get. We got a resolution out of the Security Council that said, Iraq, leave Kuwait. If you don't get out, we're going to force you out. And you do so unconditionally. The Iraqis and the Soviets as well kept coming to us and saying, you got to give Saddam something to save face, to let him have something so he'll leave. And we said, wait a minute. When you go through the UN Security Council and they exercise their Chapter 7 responsibilities for the first time in history, you don't negotiate down from that. So these are some of the things that happened. This is the first and only time that the UN Security Council has used its Chapter 7 powers against a member state, the use of force against a member state of the UN. And what we did was we got a resolution that said we were entitled to use all necessary means to kick Iraq out of Kuwait unconditionally. I said it's the only time it's ever happened. It happened in the Korean War when we got a resolution, but the Soviets had walked out. But we did this with Soviet concurrence. And one of the biggest negotiating tasks I had during this time was to keep China from vetoing. And we finally got China to agree to abstain. We got our resolution 12-4, 2 against Cuba and Yemen, and 1 abstention, China. And it's the only time, as I say, that it's ever happened in the history of the United Nations. Now, President Bush 43 went to the UN before he went into Iraq in 2003, and he got a 15-0 resolution out of the Security Council, but all it said was if Saddam doesn't provide us with certain information or do certain things, there will be serious consequences. And Tony Blair needed a second resolution to satisfy his political constraints at home, so he asked us to go for a second resolution. President Bush did. We didn't have the votes. We went for it, and we couldn't get it. And I've always said I think that was a mistake to go for that resolution without knowing that we had the votes to get it. So that's one of the things that led to all of the difficulties in the second Iraq War between the United States and China, and United States and France, and the United States and some other countries. Now there are a lot more things we need to talk about, but I hope that's an answer to your question.
That's a very useful kind of overview, and a lot more than that. One of the things you said that you learned in your running of political campaigns was how important the sequence was. And I know my students, in reading various accounts of this, looked at how centrally you put the Soviets first and foremost, and nurturing that all the way through, from political isolation to sanctions to force. And then people know about coalition building, which we talked about last time, and the importance of sequence there. And sometimes the normal rules don't seem to apply. For example, get your allies on board first. And yet, if you brought the Israelis on up front, you couldn't do it, at least explicitly, right?
You talking about Madrid?
No, and for the Gulf War, if you said we want the Israelis on board in the coalition to build the political and military coalition, it'd be very tough to do that.
That's right.
Similarly, if you went to the Congress, the internal negotiation first, and got a no, it'd be really hard to do the external one.
That's correct.
So, some of the rules of thumb, you guys were smart enough to kind of work around. And could you talk a little bit about the sequencing and staging aspects of putting this coalition together?
Okay, I think I mentioned, and I know I mentioned in the first session, that there was a lucky circumstance, quite frankly. Saddam Hussein was a great miscalculator, and he miscalculated badly in this instance. He invaded Kuwait when George Bush was meeting with Margaret Thatcher in Aspen, Colorado, and I was meeting with the Soviet foreign minister in Irkutsk, Siberia. And we took advantage of those things. I told you earlier how this was the beginning of the coalition. Shevardnadze was so embarrassed about the bad advice he got from the KGB, which he relayed to me, that he then agreed to meet me in Moscow and stand up and condemn the invasion. We never had any thought of bringing Israel into the coalition because we didn't want this to be seen to be a U.S.-Israeli effort against an Arab state. That would have been a counterproductive thing. And in fact, we went to great lengths and many negotiations to convince Israel not to react to the Scuds that were coming in there, to let us deal with it by taking out those batteries in western Iraq, and to refrain from letting the Iraqis particularly say, wait a minute, this is just the United States and the Zionist entity taking on an Arab state. And I must say this, I'd mentioned Prime Minister Shamir earlier, and how while we disagreed on policy, we had a very fine personal relationship. And I want to tell you, it was because of Prime Minister Shamir that Israel stayed out of that war. And had she got into the war, it would have been a very, very serious difficulty for us from the standpoint of continuing to prosecute it. Shamir's defense minister wanted to get into the war. Israel has a record, a very fine record of always taking care of itself, reacting when it's attacked. It was quite a feat, quite frankly, to get Prime Minister Shamir to agree that they would not do this and to let the United States take care of it. With respect to the Soviet Union, it became clear very early on, because we were dealing with a Soviet client state, that we had to have them in the coalition, or there wouldn't be a coalition that could go to the UN Security Council. Now, we would have done this whether we went to the Security Council or not. President Bush felt very strongly, and I did too, that we had the authority under Article 51 of the UN Charter under the self-defense article of the Charter, to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, because the Kuwaitis had come to us, government in exile, and asked us to do it. So we had the legal authority in our view. But we recognized that if we could get a UN resolution, we could portray this for what it was, which was Iraq against the rest of the world. And furthermore, we knew that if we could get a UN Security Council resolution, we might have a better shot with the US Congress. Remember now, we were a Republican administration with a Democratic House of Representatives and a Democratic Senate. And boy, were they unenthusiastic about giving us any help to go start a war in the Middle East. And I never will forget how many times I would go up to testify, and I'd be met up there on the Hill with this, Mr. Secretary, how many dead Americans is it worth to do what you're going to do? And by the way, how can we pay for this when we have all of these social obligations here and so forth? So we needed to figure out some way to get the Congress on board. That's the way you get the American people on board. But President Bush would have done this whether we'd gotten an affirmative vote in Congress or not. But having the UN Security Council give us a resolution of force put us in the position of being able to go to a senator and say, Senator, you mean you're not going to support the President of the United States on this, but the President of Ethiopia is supporting it? And it was fairly effective. But even then, we only won the Senate 52-47. Again, this is another instance, I think, where the political experience really helped me. But we would have done it anyway, but it was really important if we could do it to get that UN resolution, and we did. And to do that, we had to sequence. And we did sequence. And we kept the Soviets at the forefront of it because they could, with the use of their veto, we kept the Chinese at the forefront of it too. They were both very lukewarm about the idea, and either one of them could have killed the UN security resolution by veto.
Could I ask a follow-up? The sequencing, obviously, you thought it through carefully. The other thing that I find fascinating and quite brilliant about the strategy relates to something else you said. You were persuaded, because you knew, President Bush was going to do this anyway. He said he would not let it stand, and you knew, and you communicated to others, that he was not going to let it stand. Okay. So in persuading people to join the coalition, I'm wondering whether an additional argument might be, look, he may not be prepared to withdraw without war, but the best chance we have is if we show him that the world is against him, right, and that the American Congress is behind it and has authorized it. Right. Because then those who, in fact, weren't enthusiastic were sort of thinking, well, what they're saying is the best way to perhaps prevent this armed conflict is for me to line up behind my leader. And I'm just wondering, I suspect that was part of the conscious strategy.
That was part of it, but remember this, there weren't any converts left to convert after we got that UN resolution and the congressional vote.
No, but I'm saying in getting the congressional vote, I think an additional thing would be to say to the Doves, look, if we're going to have any chance of getting him out, or did you just assume, did no one think there would be any chance that the threat of war might get Saddam to pull back?
Well, I think you're right. And that entered into our calculus when we decided to take these steps and do these things. We were very fortunate. I mean, particularly with that UN resolution, that's not an easy thing to do. Another thing we did, which when I reflect back on it, I find rather surprising, we had Arab troops participating with us, including from Syria. I mean, the Syrians sent 2 divisions into the Gulf, and they were part of the coalition. The Egyptians, the Syrians, the Jordanians, and it was truly an unprecedented international coalition. But we would never have gotten to Congress had we not first gotten the UN.
Mr. Secretary, you then had you then had to think about the end game of the diplomacy before the American counterattack against Saddam Hussein, and you went to meet Tariq Aziz on January 9th. And I think we know now from all the books that have been published, there was a lot of disagreement within the Bush administration about whether or not you should go.
That's right.
To meet Tariq Aziz. You were trying to exhaust diplomacy and show the world that there were no other options. How did you handle the internal battle? And a question about Tariq Aziz, if he had showed up with a really creative proposal for diplomacy, might that have stopped the U.S. coalition in its tracks?
It could have really been a problem, but there was never any, I never had any difficulty internally, but for the reason I mentioned to you in the first session. I was seamless with my president. I knew, I mean, he had come to me earlier and said, he'd earlier made a proposal, you may have forgotten this, that I go to Baghdad and meet with Saddam and that Tariq Aziz come to Washington and meet with him. But Saddam wouldn't give us a date that didn't back right up to our deadline of January 15. He had time to see people like John Connolly and Oscar Wyatt from Houston, his old buddies and things. They went over there to see him. He could make time for them, couldn't make time for the Secretary of State of the United States. But he was a real miscalculator, I got to tell you. But there wasn't really, there was a lot of nervousness. The Saudis were nervous. They thought that I might make a deal. There were some in the administration who were nervous because I was known for sometimes reaching agreements and making things happen. Bad deal, I guess. But anyway, there was never any chance that we were going to negotiate down from the language of a UN Security Council resolution. And that language was quite clear. Get out of Kuwait unconditionally. So if you read the transcript, it's been declassified now, of that meeting with Tariq Aziz, you find it fascinating because he kept bringing up things like, we got to give the Palestinians something. Saddam has to have something that he can point to. And we said, no, wait a minute. We got a United Nations Security Council resolution. We're not here to negotiate down from that. And we didn't. And I can understand the nervousness, but my president wasn't nervous, okay? Let the other nervous Nellies be nervous, okay, but there's only one vote, you know, in an administration. The only person who has a vote is the president. And I knew where I was with my president, and he knew where I was, and he knew I wasn't going to negotiate down from that resolution.
Which would have been better coming out of that meeting? If he just knuckled under and said, okay, we're out? Or many people at the time said, that's the nightmare scenario. We need a visible victory. We need to weaken him militarily, and that's more in the U.S. and regional interest. How do you rate those?
Well, I don't know that I would rate a hypothetical, but because I think what we did was really the right thing to do, and that it unfolded in a textbook case way. I tell people, if you want to know how to fight a war, go look at the way we fought that war. We said what we were going to do. We did it. We got the rest of the world with us. Then we got the American people in the Congress with us. And guess what? We got everybody else to pay for it. We didn't pay for that war. We got the people in the region whom we were helping, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and others. That war cost $65 billion. We paid $10 billion of it. And everybody else paid the rest. That's the way to fight a war. And the one thing that could have given us a problem would have been if he had started pulling out, started a withdrawal, but it wasn't going to be complete, and just started. He jacked us around from that standpoint. But he wasn't smart enough to do that. I mean, he really was a miscalculator.
I'd like to. I wrote an article once saying that Saddam was the world's worst negotiator.
Yeah.
And in one respect only, he was like my beloved late father-in-law, who was a wonderful man and not like Saddam in any other respect. and you're going to have to put yourself back. My father-in-law and my wife's mother went to Florida every year between about 1950 and 1975, And each year, my father-in-law wanted to buy a condominium for last year's price. He never bought one. And it's often struck me that, and it happened repeatedly, that Saddam could have done, if Saddam had been advised by someone as able as you, he could have done things that would have put enormous pressure on our coalition. I mean, you just gave an example.
Yeah.
He doesn't commit to getting out entirely, but he says he starts moving out rather slowly, taking a bunch of stuff with him on the way. Query under those circumstances whether you can begin a war.
That's right.
And there were similar things where he would make offers, which when facts had changed on the ground, which if made earlier, might have made a difference, at least in terms of putting pressure on our coalition, because it was a pretty fragile one. I mean, as you say, 52-48 in the Congress. And I guess my question is, other than a slow pullout, were there other moves that in terms of this international chess game, you really thought about where we hope he doesn't do this? Because if so, it's going to make our hand a lot harder.
No, the only thing we really worried about was an actual partial pullout beginning by the deadline date. An announcement from him that he was going to pull out and nobody would believe. I don't think a lot of people would believe. And look, there were our allies in that coalition wanted him out of there. Okay, so I don't think that would have been a restraining, and I don't think that would have caused a defeat in the Congress in either the House or the Senate. We'd given him, after all, 6 months. We set our deadline 6 months before it came.
There was another possible barrier to the invasion. It was Yevgeny Primakov. You had a good relationship with Shevardnadze, but Gorbachev asked his Middle East specialist, Primakov, to travel to Baghdad, meet with Saddam. I think we received him 2 or 3 times at the White House, as I remember it. And did you worry that there was a gap between Shevardnadze and Primakov and that the Soviets might turn on us and try to prevent this war from occurring?
No, because we knew where Gorbachev was, and he's the boss. Gorbachev didn't want us to start the war. He didn't vote. They voted for the use of force resolution, all necessary means. In fact, I got that agreement from Gorbachev himself at his dacha outside of Moscow. But they felt, I believe, that they could talk us out of actually starting the war. And they made many efforts to do that, Nick, not just with Primakov, but with Gorbachev himself calling President Bush. I remember he called him a number of times. And then Besmertnik, after Shevardnadze resigned, and Besmertnik was the new foreign minister of the Soviet Union, he came at us several times. Said you can't, first to moderate the air war, and second, don't start the ground war. First, don't start the air war, then moderate end the air war, don't start the ground war. How terrible this is going to be. So they made every effort that they could. They were not a part of the coalition in terms of troops or anything like that, but they worked on us pretty hard. But that would have been a terrible mistake for us to agree at that point. I mean, the truth of the matter is we didn't need them much after we got our use of force resolution through the Security Council, because there wasn't much they could do about it.
One of the other issues we talked about this morning was we had this decisive victory in the desert, our troops, our coalition against Saddam Hussein. President Bush had to make a big decision. The road to Baghdad was open. Does he go down that road and occupy the Iraqi capital and try to take over the Iraqi government? He made this very important decision. And then we refought that issue over the next 12 years, and we refought it in 2003.
Yeah.
How do you look at that whole decision with the benefit of this, of hindsight?
Well, I'm convinced President Bush made the right decision. We used to get, by the way, there was not one advisor to President Bush 41 who thought we should go to Baghdad. Not one. We were all right there, all of his top advisors. We were right there in the Oval Office talking to Schwarzkopf on the telephone in the region when we made the decision to end the war. We were killing literally thousands of Iraqi troops fleeing up the highway of death. And Colin said, And even Schwarzkopf agreed at the time, it's time to pull the plug. We've done what we said we were going to do. And so there was nobody was agitating at all about going to Baghdad, and our military really didn't want any part of that. They didn't want to have to occupy that great big Arab country. We were concerned about it from a political standpoint for fear that it would create all sorts of ethnic tensions and unrest and so forth, the kind of thing that we faced after the 2003 invasion. So I'm convinced that we made the right decision. For a number of years after we got out, we used to get questions about why didn't you guys take care of Saddam when you had the chance? And guess what? After 2004, 2003, we never got those questions anymore.
Could we move from the sort of the broader view to some of the most challenging moments you faced in the various negotiations that added up to the UN resolution or Congress? Because there must have been points when you said, I don't know if this is going to work. And if you could help us, take us to some of those moments and talk us through.
But remember, we were going to go anyway.
And that was a crucial part of your diplomacy.
You bet. You bet.
No deal means we go.
We had a strong hand. Well, we weren't going to permit him to continue to sit there and brutally occupy that. If you look at Amnesty International's report of that occupation, it is absolutely terrifying. It's brutal. So we knew we were going. And so I don't, there wasn't any. One of the things that I think was really important, I don't believe I mentioned this morning, in the earlier session. There were some. First thing we did was put an arms embargo on Iraq, and a naval blockade. It was a blockade, wasn't it? Yeah, a naval blockade. And guess what? Shortly after we put that blockade on, we get wind. Our intelligence picks up the fact that an Iraqi ship is sailing down the Gulf toward Oman, and we get people saying, "Wait a minute! You put on this naval blockade. Now you got a ship that's running it. You're going to lose credibility terribly if you don't take out that ship." I'm out at my ranch in Wyoming trying to grab 3 days of rest, and I'm talking to Shevardnadze with a military TACSAT at that time, we didn't even have a phone in my cabin in Wyoming. So I'm talking to him from military TACSAT on the boulder outside my cabin. And he said, I said, we've got to do something about that ship, Edward. I said, we got a naval blockade. It's running the blockade. Our credibility depends on it. He says, give me 48 hours. Let me have 48 hours to talk to Saddam or to talk to the Iraqis. I said, okay, I'll see what I can do. I was talking to President Bush. President Bush said, look, a lot of people want to take that ship out. Prime Minister Thatcher thinks we're going to be really in trouble if we don't do it. Secretary of Defense thinks we need to do it. National Security Advisor thinks we need to do it. Everybody thinks we need to do it. I said, let me tell you something, pal. I said, I think we still have 2 days within which we can take that ship out. We've just succeeded in getting the Soviets to come along and support the idea we ought to reverse this aggression. We don't need to act precipitously when we can act in another couple of days and take care of it. The president went with me. Gets back to what I said earlier about the relationship you need to have with your president. He went with me because we'd been friends for 35 years. He trusted me. I had been his political campaign manager, all that stuff. So that was a critical point. I was way out in Wyoming. I wasn't even there where I could argue the case personally in front of him. He went with me. And the coalition stayed intact. And we gave them their 2 days, and I can't remember what happened. I don't remember whether the ship was turned around or whether we took it out, but we gave them their 2 days.
And there, your eye was on, let's hold this coalition together.
Absolutely.
The first order of business is keep the Soviets in. If we have to take a modest hit on the ship, so be it. But keep that coalition together.
Absolutely. Well, it wasn't much of a hit. I mean, it was a ship that was sailing. We knew we had 2 days within which we could torpedo it.
So another moment that or challenge that must have been tough. Ultimately, the Chinese abstained.
That was a hard one.
Can you take us through the actions before?
Chinese are very tough. They're very tough. They are tough to negotiate with. They are somewhat inscrutable sometimes. And I'd really been working this one with Chen Chichen, who was, by the way, a good person and a fine foreign minister of the People's Republic of China. But this was in the aftermath of Tiananmen. And Tiananmen Square had strained the relationship, but President Bush had been our first representative in China. And he knew how important this relationship was, and he was doing everything he could to keep it together. And the Chinese appreciated that. We did put some sanctions on them, but they were modest sanctions, and the relationship was not totally ruptured, but it was under strain. And I was dealing not just with Chen Chichen, the foreign minister, but also with Li Peng, the prime minister, who was a hardline guy. And they were of a mind that they were not going to support action against a member state of the Soviet Union. The use of force, the UN against a member state of the Soviet Union, a member state of the UN, we can't do that. And I never will forget on several occasions, trying to get him to agree to abstain. I said, well, if you can't vote for this, how about abstaining? And we had to negotiate a deal whereby we would agree to receive a high-level Chinese visitor in Washington as a quid pro quo for their abstaining. And this was right in the aftermath of Tiananmen, and it wasn't very popular in the United States then for us to be receiving a high-level Chinese visitor. But we did it, and we got them to abstain.
So it would seem to be a good point to segue to the Madrid conference, so we can talk about that diplomacy a little bit and then open things up for plenty of time for questions. Could I ask you, as you did with the Gulf War, to put this in context? What's the big picture? How should we think about Madrid?
Yeah, that's good. The big picture is that this is one, of course, the most intractable problems that any Secretary of State will ever face. It's been there for a long time. The United States has a big interest in a stable Middle East. We have a special relationship with Israel that's always going to be there, and we will always be there for Israel, regardless of whether we have Republicans or Democrats in the White House. But it's not necessarily Israel right or wrong, it's Israel right, and we're good allies. We had defeated Arab rejectionism in the Gulf by taking care of Iraq, the fourth largest army in the world, and a threat to the security of Israel. So we had credibility and with Israel for that. Israel had refrained from entering the war, even though she'd been subjected to Scud missile attacks. We were very appreciative of that. We had great credibility with the people in the Gulf that we'd protected by kicking Saddam out of Kuwait. And it was a good time for us to make a major effort on Middle East peace. And anyway, some of the people who joined the coalition wanted us to say we would do that. And we said, look, a lot of people wanted us to link the two. And we said, no linkage. We're not linking action on the Middle East peace process with getting Iraq out of Kuwait. They need to get out, and need to get out unconditionally. But guess what? When this is over, we're willing to try and make an effort to re-energize peace talks between Arabs and Israelis. So after we'd defeated Arab rejectionism in the Gulf, we had credibility with both the Israeli side and the Arab side, and we used that to bring all of Israel's neighbors to the table to meet face-to-face with it for the first time ever. First time ever, all of her Arab neighbors met face-to-face. The taboo, we broke a big taboo. That taboo was that these Arab countries wouldn't sit down face-to-face and negotiate peace with Israel, because that was tantamount to recognizing Israel's right to exist. And we were able to get that we were able to get that done. We had also just revoked in the UN the Zionism is racism resolution in the General Assembly. So we had additional credibility from the Israeli side as a consequence of that. And we were finally able to get the Arabs to agree to this. The key to it was Hafiz Assad, who was the father of the current dictator in Syria. And he was, the Israelis themselves will tell you that Assad's a tough customer, but he's a known quantity. We know who he is and what he is. And when he's tough to get an agreement from, but if he gives you an agreement, he'll keep it. And that was the game, that was the ground when I was beginning these talks. And so I worked a lot on Assad. And he was the last one to come along. We got the Saudis at next to last, and we got Assad last. And when he agreed to come to Madrid, the Madrid Peace Conference, then we knew we had it. But there was a lot of negotiating with a lot of different countries in order to make that Madrid Peace Conference happen. People say, well, nothing happened as a consequence of Madrid. You broke that taboo, and that was great. And now, from time to time, the parties talk. But I would dispute that. The Jordan-Israel peace agreement was flowed directly from the Madrid conference, even though it was negotiated, and the Norwegians played the major role in getting that to happen.
So you've got all this credibility, and the situation has changed, and you say, okay, we're going to try a serious peace initiative. But getting to that point, everybody had a problem, and everybody wanted all kinds of, assurances that were incompatible and so forth. And broadly speaking, the Arabs wanted a multilateral conference with substance. The Israelis wanted to do things bilaterally with very little substance. They didn't want to deal with a PLO period. And everyone was using the other's conditions as a reason why they didn't have to move.
That's correct. You're right.
Can you talk us through kind of how you orchestrated that?
What we did was, with respect to the PLO question, we talked to Palestinians from within the territories, not Palestinians in the diaspora in Tunis under Arafat. That was seen to be a terrorist organization at the time, and neither the Israelis nor we dealt with them. But we found Palestinians from within the territories who, of course, were taking their orders from Tunis, and we knew that, and the Israelis knew that. But it was a cutout, and it worked. That's how we got the Palestinians to the table with Israeli agreement. You mentioned one other thing. Everybody needed some sort of assurance or guarantee. So we actually gave letters of assurance to the various parties. And for the most part, those letters of assurance said the United States will not change its position on various issues, peace, settlements, whatever the various issues were. And we actually gave letters of assurance to each of the parties that we brought to Madrid and worked those letters out, and they were not conflicting. I mean, we made sure that they didn't conflict, and everybody got their letter of assurance. I'm not sure that the Israelis were ecstatic about coming to Madrid in the final analysis. I never will forget Shamir telling me, again, I only met with him one-on-one. We're sitting there and we're on good terms personally. He looked at me, he said, what'd you give them? I said, I didn't give them anything, Mr. Prime Minister. He said, well, why do you think they're coming? They're changing 25 years of policy. I said, well, I think they're coming because they have made a strategic calculation to lean forward for peace. And I think they want to see whether or not there's any potential here for anything to happen. And they came. And Madrid I would argue that Madrid was a success. If for no other reason, then it broke that taboo. But that was a really hard one to put together. And I had a very adroit group of assistants at the State Department at the time who helped me with it, including Aaron David Miller and Dan Kurtzer and Dennis Ross and Bill Burns, who's now the Deputy Secretary of State. we had a great team, and we got it done. And most people didn't think that would ever happen. And it's, you know, I've said before, and I'll say this here again, it's just a crime, a terrible shame that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, because there was a government that leaned forward for peace in Israel, and he was a man of peace, and he could do it because he'd been the military hero in the wars against the Arabs, and he was a wonderful person, a great friend, and the world is worse off, the region's far worse off by virtue of the fact that he was assassinated. And I think had he lived, even though we were defeated for re-election, I think something still could have happened if Rabin had lived under the Clinton administration. But if George H.W. Bush had been re-elected with Yitzhak Rabin to work with, I really think we might have gotten something done, but that's all speculative. But the Madrid Peace Conference was a hard one to pull off, because you really had a lot of moving parts. But when the Syrians said they would come, then that was
yeah, so it sounds like if you've got, you know, the Saudis, the moderate Arabs, the Syrians say yes, and there's a PLO structure, for the Israelis to say no at that point's too hard.
They couldn't say no.
Yeah.
No,
so
they couldn't say no.
Kind of a coalition, a reluctant coalition you built.
That's right.
Nick, you had some.
Well, the Saudis were interesting too, because they wanted, you know, they supported this idea, but then when the time came to say they'd come to the multilaterals, they didn't come as parties to the bilaterals. But I wanted them to come to the multilateral. And when the time came to get them to do it, I remember talking to King Fahd himself, and you know, he was very appreciative of what we had done in the Gulf with Iraq, because they were really fearful of Iraq. So I think that's one reason they made the decision to come to the multilaterals.
Nick? Secretary, on the Middle East, of course, this is the most complex part of the world. You had to reconcile and balance what we were saying privately to the Israelis with some very tough public messages. In fact, some of the toughest public messages we've ever given to the Israelis. At the AIPAC conference in 1989, you said, now it's time to...
That was before we tried to go to Madrid.
Right, to put aside the vision of a greater Israel.
Well, you know who wrote that, don't you? Dennis Ross. I told Dennis, I said, Dennis, here I am, a brand new Secretary of State, and you have me go to the AIPAC meeting and say, put aside the dream of a greater Israel. I said, how can you do this to a new Secretary of State?
But another time you gave the Israelis publicly the number of the White House switchboard. Right. So when do you...
By the way, I gave that to everybody in the region. It was interpreted to mean the Israelis, because they were the ones at that time who were being very recalcitrant. And I said, look, tell our friends in the region when you get serious about peace to give us a call, and here's the telephone number.
So how do you decide when to go public and when to have arguments privately?
Well, I don't know how you quantify, how I answer that question. I think you have to do that on instinct and gut reaction. Madrid would never have happened if we had not denied Israel $10 billion in loan guarantees that they wanted from us, in addition to all of the other assistance that we give them. And we're very generous with Israel, and we should be, and we will continue to be. And when we said no to the $10 billion in additional loan guarantees, we said, we want you, we expect you to please pay some respect to what has been U.S. policy under every Republican and Democratic administration forever, and that is, we do something about settlements. We want you to agree not to use that $10 million for settlements. And the Israelis say, well, don't worry about it, we'll get it from the Congress. Prime Minister Shamir said that to me. He said, well, then don't worry about it, we'll just get it from the Congress. I said, oh, really? I said, we'll meet you on Capitol Hill, and we did. And it's only the second time they've ever been defeated up there on an issue like that. But it was critical to getting Madrid. Madrid would not have happened had we not done that. And bear in mind now, this is $10 million over and above all the other, and they could have gotten it if they'd simply said they would pay some respect to what American policy was with respect to settlements. It really moved the process forward, actually. And I want to say this, too. Our Israeli friends, I think, will be there for us. We will be there. We will always be there for Israel. They respect strength. They don't respect weakness. And I think that there was a certain begrudging respect for the position we took on that, particularly after we won it on Capitol Hill. And those are the kind of things sometimes that you've got to do if you want to move the process forward. Now, are some of those things politically costly, domestically sometimes? Sometimes, not always.
So one last question before we open to the audience, and that's to actually look forward. Madrid started a process that in fits and starts was the Jordanian peace treaty, the Oslo agreement, and on and on. And now, as you look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which seems pretty frozen, how would you think about negotiations or getting negotiations going or waiting? How do you think about that challenge?
Well, number one, you're going to have to wait till after November 2012. Nothing's going to happen before our elections. And I think you're also going to have to wait upon two other occurrences. Number one, you're going to have to wait until the Palestinian divide is cured. You have two Palestinian polities right now. You got Fatah and you got Hamas. And you can't get an agreement. How can you negotiate an agreement when you only have half the Palestinians at the table? You can't. So there needs to be some sort of a construct developed, like we developed in 1991, where we dealt with Palestinians from within the territories who were not officials of the PLO. And that gave us deniability, gave the Israelis deniability. They agreed to it. We did it that way. And the third thing I think you need to do is probably to have a government in Israel that will lean forward for peace, the way Yitzhak Rabin's government did. Now, I was dealing, again, I'll say, with a hardline government, Yitzhak Shamir's government, but they were not as, I don't think, quite as reluctant as the current government of Israel is to move forward on peace. I think that the current government feels like Israel is now pretty secure. So why go out there and negotiate an agreement which, while it may look like it's secure, is really not secure? Why take that chance? And of course, the answer to why take that chance is Israel has got to maintain, wants to maintain, should maintain her character as both a democratic state and a Jewish state. As long as she stays in occupation of all those Arab lands and all those Arab people, it's going to be hard for her to retain her character as a democratic state. And it's really important that she do that.
Just a short follow-up. I find that analysis quite persuasive. Is the implication of it that now is really not the time to try to use American power to make something happen?
Yes. President Obama, you know, I've said before that I support totally his position on Iran. I support his position in many other areas, not domestic policy now, but foreign policy. Not domestic policy. But I think he made a terrible mistake. I praised him publicly, as a matter of fact, for taking on the Arab-Israeli dispute in his first term. Right. Too often our presidents wait until the second term because of the domestic political consequences. He took it on his first term, but he took it on the narrow issue of settlements, and went out and said no more settlements, and then the Secretary of State said no more settlements. That means no more expansion of settlements, means this. And then within a month or two, after he got a little pushback, he caved. Well, you don't do that. They can smell that kind of weakness 5,000 miles away. And they have. So you're not going to get anything done, at least until after the election. Maybe not then. But you need to have all three of those things. You need to wait till after our election. You need to solve the Palestinian polity problem, and you need to get a government in Israel that really wants peace with its neighbors, a secure peace, not just a paper peace, a secure peace. You know, when I was Secretary of State, I told told Shamir and Assad, I said, look, the Golan's an easy deal to do. It's the West Bank and Gaza that's complicated. Golan's easy. You have a discrete, specific piece of territory here. I said, why don't we just agree right here and now, we'll put U.S. peacekeepers on the Golan, the way we've done in Sinai. Well, interestingly enough, neither one of them liked that idea, which indicates to me that they both had trouble taking the necessary action to get to peace. But you could deal with a security problem vis-a-vis the Golan. That would be, and you only have one entity. But now with Syria erupting in civil war, who knows what's going to happen there? And I know for a fact that the Israeli government is nervous about what's going to happen, and should be, because we don't know what's going to happen. We're nervous about what's going to happen. And, so there.
So we would love to open this up to, especially to students, and we'll ask for short, clear questions. Hold the microphone close to your mouth so we can closely hear. Floor's open. Andrew?
This gentleman in the front row's been trying to get a question though, but yeah. Do you know who he is?
If you could stand when you're called on, that would help. Thanks.
Thank you for being here. My name is Andrew Sternlight, and I'm a second year at the business school.
That's better. And don't talk so fast, please.
Sure. Excuse me for asking you a hypothetical question. Coming back to the Gulf, had the Soviets not supported the U.S., how then would you have approached the negotiations with Iraq?
Well, we never really had any negotiations with Iraq, because as I told you, we were never going to negotiate down from a UN resolution that says get out unconditionally. If the Soviets hadn't gone along and we could not get a resolution out of the UN, we would have acted under our Article 51 charter, Article 51 of the Charter of the UN, at the request of the Kuwaiti government, and we would have gone in and kicked Iraq out of Kuwait. We might not have gotten a vote, we might not have gotten the Congress to vote in support of it, but we would have done it anyway, under the president's foreign policy powers. But fortunately, we were able to get not only the international community, but also the Congress in the manner I've outlined to you. But we would have done it anyway.
A mature student.
Sure. Thank you. Charles Cogan, Kennedy School. Mr. Secretary, do you think a case can be made for the idea that Saddam felt that he could get away with the invasion of Kuwait on the basis of public statements by Americans, John Kelly to the Congress and April Gillespie to Saddam himself?
Yeah, she met with him. He called her in with I think 25 minutes notice. It was during the day over there. She had no chance to come back to the department and ask for instructions, and she didn't. She used the guidance that she had before her, which is the United States doesn't take a position with respect to border disputes between these Persian Gulf countries, because there are still a lot of border disputes down there. That's what she told him. He may have interpreted that to mean that we wouldn't do anything about it. Might have. She was following her guidance. She didn't do anything wrong at all. That was our policy. But that, border disputes and occupying the whole country are two different things, frankly. So if he did interpret it to mean that, he was once again wrong. He was a beautiful miscalculator, and he'd always go right up to the brink, I remember speaking to a group of American airmen in a hangar in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, after I came on my way back to the United States from the Geneva meeting with Tariq Aziz, which had lasted 7 hours. And I knew we were going to war on the 16th of January. This was about the 11th, 10th or 11th. And these guys, these kids had been over there for about 6 or 7 months. And I spoke to them and talked to them about how important their service was and how much we appreciated the American people. And one of these kids stood up and said, Mr. Secretary, he said, when are we either going to go home or kick some butt? I said, well, I knew when they were going to kick some butt, but I couldn't tell them. I said, you're not going to have to wait too much longer. And I said, but you know, Saddam Hussein has this reputation of always taking things right up to the brink. Well, guess what? We're at the brink. And that's the way I answered that question. And so we started the war when we told him we would. We said, you either get out by the 16th of January or we're going to kick you out. And we did.
Yes. And please stand when we call. It's easier to get the mic to you.
Sheikh Mohammed Belal, Kennedy School. I'm a student of Professor Nick Barnes. So as a student of negotiation, we always mostly remain preoccupied, rightly perhaps, with the concept of national interests. But in this world where the lines of border are getting blurred at a rate which is much faster than what you are at the State Department.
I hope you're getting this.
So how do you think that we should reconcile with the concept of national interest and as our interest as a global citizen?
You got it?
Yes, so I'll just, Sheikh Bilal is a student in our class, my class from Bangladesh. We've been talking in class about sometimes the contradiction between what's in our national interest for what might be in the human interest. President Kennedy talked about that after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And how do you reconcile that contradiction? Because we have obligations to humanity as well as to our own country.
This is the big issue in the formulation and implementation of foreign policy for the United States of America. Our foreign policy is based on our principles and values, as well it should be, because they're very important in the development of our country, and they make us a special country in some respects. But our foreign policy is also based on the national interest. And you just have to find a balance between the two. My view is you ought to never be all idealism or all realism. You ought to have a balance of the two. But I will tell you this, as somebody who's run 5 presidential campaigns for 3 different Republican presidents, if you don't have a national interest, significant national interest, attached in some way to your policy, you're not going to be able to support it for very long on the part of the American people. And when you lose the American people, you're going to lose the policy. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's to some extent what happened in Iraq, when particularly in 2007, 2008, at the low point of the Second Iraq War. You have to find a significant national interest. The national interest in going into Iraq the second time was that they were developing a nuclear weapon. When that turned out not to be true, and we were taking casualties and spending money, it was hard to maintain the support of the American people. Vietnam's probably the best example of that. So you don't discount principles and values, but we cannot be the policeman for the world. We cannot solve every humanitarian crisis. We cannot stop every genocide from taking place. We just can't do it. We just physically can't do it. So you have to have a balance between principles and values on the one hand and national interest on the other.
Yes. Yes, you. Yes, Chad, behind you. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Chad Ellis. I had the good fortune to be Jim's student a little over a decade ago. I wanted to go back. You mentioned a couple of times the commitment that you had not to negotiate down from the UN resolution. And it struck me because sort of a classic negotiation tool, when you have a very strong position, is often to make a small concession to allow the other side room to get out. So I'd love it if you could elaborate a little bit on why the thinking was that it was so important not to negotiate down from that resolution.
Well, because we wanted to set an example for the post-Cold War world that unprovoked aggression against a small neighbor wouldn't pay. So we weren't willing to pay Saddam anything to get out, when the rest of the world had said, get out and get out unconditionally. That was it.
Yes. Wait, this way. Thanks, Polly.
Thank you. My name is Abhinav. I'm from the business school. My question to you is, we've been fascinated by what you have done and the significance of it. What are the things which you did went wrong or didn't go according to your plan, and how did you recover from those?
So this is a question that actually Jim and I have been talking about asking you. You've got a plan, and you know what you want to do. Something goes wrong, and you meet resistance or meet defeat. So it's a general theoretical question. You know, what do you do then?
You go on Plan B.
Because you followed the 5 Ps. Huh? You got the 5 Ps.
Yeah.
Prepared Plan B.
Yeah. If you followed the 5 Ps, prior preparation prevents poor performance, you've got a Plan B.
It's actually the 6 Ps with prior
Preparation prevents poor performance.
Plan B.
It's not Plan B. The 6 P is what I said.
Got it. Yes.
You know, not every negotiation is successful, too. Let's remember that.
You ejected Saddam Hussein from Iraq.
No, not from Iraq.
I mean from Kuwait, sorry. You deliberately decided not to cross the borders, but you left him in power. And a few months later, he gassed his own citizens. Couldn't have done anything better to tie his hands so that he would not do such things, even though he is left in power.
Yeah, and Sia is a student from Ethiopia, and we've been talking in class. We did a case study on the Iraq War. And as you know very well, at the end of the war, Saddam was able to use his attack helicopters to go after the Shia as well as the Kurds.
Right.
And there was a massive refugee flow, and unfortunately, lots of people died. And Sia's question, as I understood it, was, I mean, how did that come about, and what do we have to say to those people?
We, as I said earlier, you make mistakes when you're dealing with these issues. We made 2 mistakes, I think. I've said that I think the way we conducted that war was a textbook example of the way to fight a war, where we had the rest of the world behind us, we had the American people by virtue of the Congress behind us, and we got other people to pay for it. But we made 2 mistakes that I think were fundamental mistakes. We did not require Saddam to come down to Safwan to sign the surrender documents. And we let him fly his helicopters to reposition, allegedly to reposition his soldiers, but he used them to shut down a Shia rebellion in the south. We did the right thing by virtue of the Kurds in the north as a consequence of a trip I took there shortly after the war ended. And I saw what was happening there. Saddam was chasing the Kurds up into Turkey. And I called President Bush from the mountains of Iraq, and I said, we've got a humanitarian nightmare that may take place here. We've got to do something to protect the Kurds. Saddam is trying to kill them as they flee. And that's when we did Operation Provide Comfort. We put a no-fly zone in. We gave them a lot of humanitarian assistance and so forth. We saved them, and now, of course, that Kurdish area of Iraq is the prosperous area of Iraq, and it is the stable area of Iraq. But it was a mistake for us not to get him to come down and sign the surrender documents, and it was a mistake to let him fly his helicopters to reposition his troops. He used them against the Shia. That was a mistake.
To follow up that question, same spirit, any mistakes or things you would have done differently with respect to the Madrid conference?
No.
That worked out okay?
No, the Madrid conference, we accomplished exactly what we set out to do. And I don't think there was anything we'd do over again. I don't think we'd ask for a do-over on German unification. And I don't think we'd ask for a do-over on building the coalition to eject Iraq from Kuwait, except for those 2 things.
Yehuda University of Haifa, Israel. Mr. Secretary, later in your career, you worked on another intractable Middle Eastern conflict, the one between the Polisario, Morocco, and Algeria over Western Sahara. I'm wondering if you see any similarities between these two conflicts, and in particular the Israel-Palestine and the Western Sahara?
Yeah, of course I do. In my view, there's a lot of similarities. You have two different peoples fighting over the same land. And I only spent 7 years on the Western Sahara and never solved it. At the request of Kofi Annan, I worked for the UN, and I was a special envoy, personal envoy of the Secretary General. We at least got the parties to begin meeting together. I came up with what I thought was a really good plan whereby we amended both the Polisario and Morocco had agreed to hold a referendum under Javier Perez de Cuellar. But they'd never been able to hold that referendum. There's a lot of disputes about who's eligible to vote and everything. I came up with a proposal that said, okay, fine, let's cut through all this, stop talking about the census of 1976. Everybody that's in Western Sahara can vote. And let's have that referendum. And Morocco wasn't willing to do that, even after saying they wanted to have a referendum. I think they should have. I think they would have won that vote. They must have thought they would lose it, so they refused to do it. And the Polisario did agree that they would proceed with that kind of. So that thing is out there still on the table, and the new personal envoy is trying to generate some activity in that account, but that's a really tough one. You know why it's tough? Because none of the major powers, including the United States of America, want to expend political chits on that conflict. So they're not willing to use their political chits to find a resolution of the conflict. And it's quite tragic. You've got a lot of people who are refugees in the desert in Algeria. And it's not only that, it's keeping the Maghreb from developing economically. You've got Algeria and Morocco still arguing with each other over this conflict and over Western Sahara, and it's quite regrettable.
A couple more questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Keith Bender. I'm a freshman at the college, and I would like to know, from your perspective, how politically effective was the Patriot missile defense system in negotiations to keep Israel from retaliating for the Iraqi Scud missiles, even when the success of the intercept rate is still disputed to this day?
I don't know that. I don't know that it was just the Patriot missiles that convinced Israel not to retaliate in the first Gulf War. Although I think the Patriot missiles did take down some Scuds, but they were never designed to and couldn't be a totally impenetrable shield for Israel. And what we agreed to do after talking to Prime Minister Shamir, who said that that Israel would not intervene, we said, look, we'll take care of the Scud sites in western Iraq, and we did. We put a heck of a lot more effort into taking out those Scud sites. So I don't think it was the Patriot missile so much as it was the extra force that we used to take care of those Scuds.
One question. Go ahead, stand up.
Thank you. My name is Bara Hasibuan. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. Secretary Baker, if you had been the Secretary of State in 2003, what advice would you have given President Bush in dealing with Saddam Hussein?
In dealing with Saddam Hussein?
In 2003, yes.
Go read my article in the New York Times on August 26, 2003. What I really said then was, we ought not to underestimate what the difficulty here may be. When we kicked Iraq out of Kuwait, they were not fighting for their homeland. They might fight a heck of a lot harder for their homeland. But one thing we ought to seriously consider doing is going to the United Nations to get support and building a multilateral coalition. President Bush did that. He went to the UN. He got a 15-0 vote. We've talked about it before. But it just said there will be serious consequences. It didn't say use all necessary means. And so he did what I think he should have done. I also wrote in that article that if our intelligence, if our intelligence demonstrates that Iraq is developing a nuclear weapon, there may be every justification in the world for going in there. But don't underestimate what could be the difficulty of such an undertaking, and try and build as big a multilateral coalition as you can. That was my advice. He followed it. I mean, I'm not saying he followed it because it was my advice, but it's exactly what he did.
One final question, yes.
Me? Okay.
Yes, you, in front. The woman in front, sorry.
Hi, my name is Funa Maduka, and I'm at Harvard Business School, second-year student. Thank you, Secretary Baker, for being here today. Wanted to know your thoughts over your career of observations of negotiations between the IMF and World Bank in developing countries, and wanted to know if you believe that developing countries ever have a leg of advantage in negotiations with the IMF or World Bank, and just your reflections on those processes. We see what's happening in current events.
What was it?
So the question is, as I understood it, was negotiations between the IMF and the World Bank with developing countries, if you have observations on the fact that sometimes developing countries might be at a disadvantage in negotiating with those two big financial institutions in Washington.
Well, I don't know that I have an opinion on that. I used to spend a lot of time with the IMF, of course, as Treasury Secretary and as Secretary, and the World Bank as well. But I don't think that, some countries are always going to have more power and ability to negotiate than others. Some countries are more powerful than others. And I don't know how do you solve the problem. If there's a problem that you're pointing out, I don't know how you solve that problem. The World Bank is very, very helpful in many ways to emerging countries, developing countries. I think the World Bank is still making loans to China. And China will argue with a straight face that they're a developing country. They'll look at you, sit right there and say, we're a developing country, because they get low interest loans from the World Bank. Now, they may have cut that out now. I don't know. Have they cut it? Still doing it. I think so. Still doing it. There's a developing country for you. Second biggest economy in the world, and to be the next global superpower. But I don't know how you would cure that problem, if it's a problem. It wasn't a problem, I don't think it was a problem when I was there. I didn't see it as a problem. Particularly the World Bank. They make a special effort, of course, as you know, because their mission is development. And it's developing countries where they're granting most of their development money.
So Secretary Baker, on behalf of Nick, Bob, myself, Program on Negotiation, Future of Diplomacy Program, and this really great audience. You've told us a lot about campaigns and coalitions and unilateral action and sequencing and doing something in these various circumstances, timing when not to act, as well as the foundation for all that on personal relationships and trust that really facilitate effective diplomacy and negotiation. We'll give you a little bit of a rest now, but we want to thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And let me say one final thing before we leave, because there's one thing I haven't said in the area of negotiation. You're never going to be a good negotiator unless you're willing to walk away from a negotiation when it isn't going to succeed. So, you don't ever stake out a maximalist position. You try to get there as sequencing, as we said, as we talked about. But if you're not ready to walk, you're not going to get anywhere. The best example I can give you of that is my interminable meetings with Hafiz Assad. They always lasted for 6 or 7 hours. And one day I went into a meeting with him, and he went back on what he had told me a day or so before. And I said I was really disappointed in that. And I turned to my assistant and I said, we ought to get out of here. We're not getting anywhere on this. And he spoke Arabic. It was Ed Derigian. Yeah. And he spoke Arabic, and he said, he put his hand on my knee. He said, just a minute. He said, they're talking to each other in Arabic. And one of them just said, hey, he's getting mad. He's getting ready to leave. Just stay for another minute. I stayed for another minute, and Assad changed 40 years of policy and came to Madrid. So, but if I hadn't been ready to shut my folder and say, see you around, pal, I did tell him this. I actually told him this. I said, okay, you don't want to come and talk to the Israelis and negotiate peace. I'll tell you what you do. You go get your Golan back. You go get it back yourself. That's what I did. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Really good.